The air smelled of salt, smoke, and iron. Okinawa was burning again. It was late June 1945, and the hills still trembled with distant artillery. Among the chaos, a line of Japanese nurses, mud-streaked, uniform sleeves torn, stumbled out of a half-collapsed field hospital. Behind them, the rising sun flag had already fallen. American soldiers fanned out, rifles raised, shouting in clipped commands. One nurse clutched a roll of bandages like it was her child. Another whispered a prayer, eyes fixed on the horizon where the ocean hissed and burned. When the gunfire stopped, the silence felt heavier than the explosions. The women were surrounded, hands trembling as they were ordered to kneel. They'd been told all their lives that capture meant worse than death. Their commanders had burned manuals, destroyed syringes, and fled into the jungle. But these women stayed. Duty, fear, or both, by nightfall the captured group, around 70 women, was marched toward a makeshift U.S. camp under an orange sky thick with smoke. Reports indicate that more than 90,000 Japanese soldiers had already died here. Only about 7,000 were captured alive. These women were among the first female POW the Americans had ever processed in the Pacific Theater. Their presence confused both sides. Soldiers weren't trained for this. The women weren't prepared to live. At the camp gates, the GI hesitated. They saw nurses, not killers. Yet the rules were clear. All captives must be searched, deloused, and medically screened. An American medic noted in his diary, they looked terrified, not defiant terrified. The prisoners expected violence, humiliation, something unspeakable. Instead, they were handed canteens of water and motioned toward a tent where the next shock awaited. In the torchlight, an American officer barked an order to a translator. The man hesitated, glancing nervously at the women. Then, in broken Japanese, he repeated it twice. Eyebrows, you must shave them off. A murmur rippled through the group. Confusion, disbelief, horror. The order didn't make sense. What kind of cruelty was this? One nurse fainted. Another hid her face in her hands. To them, the eyebrows were not cosmetic. They were identity, dignity, even faith. Losing them meant losing self. The soldiers didn't explain. They simply prepared the razors, and as the steel glinted in the lamplight, every heart froze for what came next. The tent smelled of kerosene and damp canvas. A single bulb swung overhead, throwing slow circles of light across the women's faces. Outside, rain tapped against metal barrels, steady as a metronome. Inside, the order hung in the air like a riddle. Shave off your eyebrows. The translator had repeated it, voice trembling, unsure if he'd just delivered a death sentence or a joke. No one laughed. Aya, the youngest nurse, pressed her hands over her brows as if protecting her soul. Why? She whispered. No answer came. The American medic simply pointed toward a basin of steaming water. A pack of razors lined beside it, like surgical tools. His eyes didn't hold malice, just exhaustion. For him, this was procedure. For them, it was unthinkable. The women hesitated. In Japanese culture, to appear bare, face, especially in captivity, was a living humiliation. Some begged to be spared, others cursed in choked whispers, but the guards stayed calm, repeating the same line in halting Japanese, clean, must clean. The logic, they would later learn, wasn't cruelty. It was hygiene. Eyebrows, like scalp hair, were trimmed to prevent lice and infection spreading in the humid Okinawan heat. American field manuals demanded strict delousing protocols for all POW. It was survival, not symbolism. But how could they know that then? One soldier approached with a towel. Another motioned for the first volunteer. Aya closed her eyes as the blade came close. The steel was cold against her skin, dragging slow, careful strokes. She expected pain, mockery, something brutal. Instead, she felt gentleness. The soldier's hand steadied her chin, his movements deliberate, almost apologetic. When it was done, she reached up and touched the smooth skin above her eyes. Her breath caught. The face staring back from the basin's reflection wasn't hers anymore. The room fell silent, except for the soft rasp of razors scraping flesh and the low hum of rain. Reports from the camp later showed this same routine repeated on over 200 female prisoners within 3 days. To the Americans, it was efficiency. To the women, it was erasure. As the final blade fell and the last eyebrow disappeared, the air shifted. Aya blinked, unrecognizable in the mirror, and thought not of death, but of confusion, because the man holding the razor had tears in his eyes. The razors hissed like insects in the humid night. The air was thick with the smell of metal, sweat, and soap. Each stroke echoed louder than gunfire to the women sitting in that tent. For Aya, time slowed. The blade pressed close to her skin, the soldier's fingers steady yet shaking. Outside, someone coughed, a generator stuttered, then silence again. When the first eyebrow hit the basin, it floated fragile, weightless, before dissolving into the soapy water. Aya flinched, heart hammering. Around her, others sat frozen, backs straight, eyes blank. No one dared speak. They didn't understand why the Americans cared about something so small, so personal. To them, this act wasn't about hygiene. It was about power, about stripping them of their last piece of control. The American medic didn't seem cruel. He wiped sweat from his brow, his hands careful as he cleaned each razor with alcohol. Reports later described how more than 200 female POW were processed this same way in 3 days, each one disinfected, deloused, documented. For the U.S. Army, it was a matter of quarantine. For the women, it was a ceremony of shame. One nurse, older than the rest, began to cry silently. Another bit her lip until blood welled up. Yet amid the humiliation, something strange crept in. A flicker of confusion. The soldiers weren't mocking them. No laughter, no jeers. Just quiet focus, even a kind of respect. Aya watched one GI pause when a blade nicked skin, whispering something like sorry. She didn't understand the words, but she understood the tone. Compassion where she expected cruelty. In her mind, Aya remembered her commanding officer's final order before capture. Americans will treat you worse than animals. But here was one, cleaning the razor as though afraid to hurt her. The contradiction cut deeper than any blade. That night, the women slept on straw mats under canvas, faces bare, features unfamiliar even to each other. In the dim light, they looked like children or ghosts. But Aya couldn't stop thinking about the soldier's trembling hands. He hadn't looked at her like an enemy, and for the first time she wondered what if the real humiliation wasn't what they did to her body, but what her own commanders had done to her mind. Dawn came gray and heavy, the kind that swallowed sound. The rain had stopped, but the air still dripped. Inside the camp, a tin mirror, dented and dull, passed from hand to hand among the women. Each one paused, stared, and went quiet. What looked back at them wasn't themselves. Without eyebrows, their faces seemed stripped of rank, of age, of everything that once marked them as nurses, daughters, or soldiers. They looked like strangers from another world. Aya held the mirror last. Her reflection startled her. A smooth forehead, wide eyes, an innocence she hadn't seen since childhood. Around her, whispers rose. We look like ghosts, like criminals. Someone laughed nervously, a dry, broken sound. The transformation wasn't just physical. It was psychological. The women, once proud members of the Imperial Army's nursing corps, suddenly appeared vulnerable, human, and indistinguishable from one another. The effect was total. American medics observed quietly from the entrance. One noted later in a report that the procedure had successfully reduced lice risk. infection exposure, and improved sanitary control. But that sterile language couldn't capture the scene. The women weren't thinking about hygiene. They were confronting identity. In Japanese culture, facial expression and grooming were tied deeply to dignity. The removal of eyebrows meant more than cleanliness. It meant rebirth or erasure. Aya touched her face again, fingers trembling. "This isn't me," she whispered. But as she looked around, she noticed something else. The soldiers were looking away, giving them privacy. It wasn't mockery, it was restraint, respect even. That single gesture cracked the certainty she'd carried all her life, that Americans were monsters. Later that morning, the guards brought buckets of warm water, soap, and towels. The nurses, still dazed, began washing their faces and uniforms. A medic smiled faintly, saying, "Clean, very good." One of the women, Junko, older and bolder, replied in broken English, "Yes, clean new." The camp fell into a brief, uneasy quiet. The kind that happens when enemies start to see reflections of themselves. The mirror's last image lingered, eyebrowless faces gleaming in sunlight, tired but alive. Aya turned away from her reflection and noticed an American soldier approaching the fence, carrying something strange in his hand, a can wrapped in paper, shiny under the morning light. She didn't know it yet, but that small gesture would change everything. The morning sun hit the camp's wire fence like molten glass. Steam rose from puddles where the rain had fallen overnight. Aya was sitting near the corner of the yard, still touching her smooth forehead, when a voice called out softly from the other side. A young American GI stood there, helmet tilted back, holding a small metal can. He looked around nervously, then slid it through the wire. The label, bright even in grime, read "Peaches." Aya froze. Behind her, the other nurses whispered. Food outside of rations was forbidden, both for them and the soldiers. But hunger is its own language. She reached forward, slow and cautious, and took the can. The GI didn't speak Japanese. She didn't speak English. Still, his expression said everything. "Go on." She peeled the lid and inhaled. Sweetness. After weeks of salt, rice, and fear, the syrup smelled unreal. The first spoonful burned her throat with sugar. Others gathered, eyes wide. Without a word, Aya passed the can. One by one, they tasted it, each bite dissolving a layer of suspicion built over years of propaganda. According to camp records, every POW in Okinawa received roughly 2,000 calories per day, double what Japanese soldiers had been issued during combat. The U.S. Army didn't aim to humiliate, they aimed to stabilize, but for these women, the difference felt cosmic. In the Imperial Army, rations were punishment. Here they were kindness. Later that afternoon, the same GI returned. This time he brought crackers. Another soldier laughed softly, tossing a chocolate bar through the wire. The women didn't rush. They waited, unsure if it was a trick. Aya looked up, searching the soldier's face. He just smiled and walked away. No orders, no lectures, just quiet humanity. In her notebook that night, Aya wrote, "He offered sugar. Our own officers offered pain." Word spread through the camp about the gesture. The women began standing a little taller, even sharing jokes in whispers. Hunger had been replaced with something rare, curiosity, and when a medic came by the next morning carrying soap and buckets, Aya didn't shrink away. She met his eyes, because after sweetness came something stranger, the sound of laughter inside a prison camp. By the third morning, the camp smelled different, not of rot and fear, but of soap and damp linen. Buckets clanged as water was hauled from drums, steam curling in the warm Okinawan air. American medics moved between rows of tents, distributing brushes and soap bars stamped U.S. Army issue. The women watched, confused but compliant. For the first time since capture, they were told not to kneel, not to bow, just to wash. Aya knelt by a tin basin, scrubbing her arms, the sting of disinfectant biting through small cuts. Around her, laughter began to break the silence. At first awkward, then genuine. One woman splashed another. A medic chuckled. The noise startled even the guards. These were sounds no one expected in a POW camp. The process was mechanical but precise. According to Red Cross inspection logs from 1945, American run POW camps in the Pacific maintained weekly hygiene checks, ensuring prisoners received equal medical treatment as U.S. troops. Soap, bedding, water, simple things, but life, changing for those who had survived months of malnutrition and filth. The irony wasn't lost on the prisoners. Their enemy was now teaching them how to live. Aya recalled her hospital in Shuri before it was bombed, how they'd worked with bloody hands. No disinfectant, no food, no sleep. Her commanding officer used to say, "A nurse's pain is discipline." Here, an American corporal scolded her gently for scrubbing too hard. Easy, slow. She didn't know the words, but his tone was unmistakable concern. Something inside her began to unravel. If the enemy could care about her wounds, then what had her empire lied about? The nurses soon began organizing cleaning shifts on their own, repairing torn mosquito nets, even teaching the younger girls to sterilize bandages. The guards allowed it. A strange partnership formed, unspoken, fragile but real. That night, Aya sat beside a lantern, drying her hair. Her skin smelled of soap, her hands of steel basins. It wasn't freedom, but it was dignity. She opened her notebook and wrote, "They gave us soap instead of sermons." Outside, the camp was quiet, except for the chirping of crickets and the far-off hum of a generator. Somewhere beyond the wire, war still raged. But inside, something gentler was taking root. Something that frightened her more than fear itself, because it felt like trust. The camp grew quieter after sunset. Only the steady buzz of insects filled the night. Inside one of the smaller tents, Aya sat cross-legged under a dim lantern, a stub of pencil in her hand. She had torn pages from a ration ledger, brown, rough paper smelling faintly of grease. This was her secret act of rebellion, to write, to record what she wasn't supposed to feel. The first words came slowly. "We were told they would break us. Instead, they are fixing us." The pencil's tip snapped. She sharpened it with a razor edge and continued. Around her, the others slept, their breathing shallow but peaceful. The sound of soldiers laughing faintly outside drifted through the canvas. For the first time, it didn't make her flinch. Aya's entries were small, coded. She noted how every few days new supplies arrived: soap, gauze, water barrels. She described how the Americans inspected their wounds gently, even bringing morphine for infections. She wrote how she had started to see their faces not as conquerors, but as men exhausted by the same war. Historians later found diary fragments like hers across several Pacific camps. Records indicate most prisoners showed visible psychological changes within 10 to 14 days of captivity confusion, then empathy. Propaganda had painted Americans as beasts. Reality forced them to redraw that picture. One night, while writing, Aya heard quiet footsteps. It was Junko, the older nurse. She whispered, "You write too much, dangerous." Aya smiled faintly. "If I don't, no one will believe us." Junko hesitated, then nodded and left. Aya wrote until the lantern dimmed. Her final line that night, "They treat us better than our own officers did." She didn't know those words would survive decades later, translated and read in classrooms. She just needed to make sense of it all. Outside, thunder rolled over the hills. The wind picked up, rattling tent flaps. The smell of rain returned, sharp and electric. A storm was building over Okinawa again. Guards shouted, securing ropes, pulling tarps tight. Aya tucked her papers into a tin ration box and tied it beneath her cot. The lantern flickered once before going dark, and then the typhoon came. Wind howled through the camp like a living thing. Canvas snapped, ropes screamed, and rain hit the ground in horizontal sheets. The typhoon tore across Okinawa without mercy, one of those Pacific storms that could swallow entire battalions. Aya clutched the cot frame as the tent buckled inward, her hidden notebook box rattling beneath. Around her, nurses screamed over the roar. In the chaos, orders vanished. Outside, American guards were running through knee-deep mud, shouting over the storm. Floodlights flickered, then died. For a moment, there was only darkness, except for lightning that split the sky in jagged white flashes. Through one of them, Aya saw a figure, an American sergeant trying to hold up a collapsed tent pole that had pinned a Japanese nurse beneath it. He was shouting for help. Without hesitation, 2 prisoners crawled out through the mud toward him. The scene made no sense. Enemies, working side by side against nature itself. Together, they heaved the pole free. The nurse gasped, clutching her arm, and the sergeant immediately tore his poncho to make a sling. "Stay down," he yelled, but his voice was lost in the wind. Aya watched, drenched and shaking, as he guided the injured woman to safety. Official records note that the September 1945 typhoon killed more than 100 people across Okinawan camps and outposts. Yet in this one, not a single prisoner was lost. The difference was cooperation, spontaneous, instinctive. Humanity cutting through protocol. When morning came, the camp looked like a graveyard of canvas. Mud everywhere, tents shredded, food soaked. But something else lingered in the wreckage. Gratitude. Aya found the sergeant sitting in the mud, exhausted, his hands blistered from pulling ropes all night. He didn't look victorious, he looked human. She bowed slightly before him. He blinked, confused, then smiled. Later, while helping gather fallen debris, Aya felt the weight of her notebook still dry inside its tin box. She smiled faintly, proof that not everything precious had drowned. That evening, as the camp rebuilt itself plank by plank, she began to write again. But this time her words were different. Less fear, more understanding, because the typhoon hadn't just torn down tents. It had stripped away the last illusion between captor and captive. The storm had passed, but the world it left behind looked stitched together from mud and sunlight. Tarps hung like ghosts, boots squelched through puddles, yet something in the air felt lighter, like the storm had washed away more than dirt. Days later, as the camp rebuilt, an American medic appeared carrying a bulky camera. He said it was for documentation. No one understood what that really meant until the shutter clicked. Aya and the others were lined up near the fence, uniforms still patched with rain stains. Their hair cropped, eyebrows gone, faces oddly childlike. The medic adjusted the tripod, looked through the viewfinder, and said softly, "Hold still." He wasn't ordering, he was asking. That single tone changed everything. Click. A moment trapped forever. The women squinted into the light, the lens reflecting tiny dots of sun. 1 or 2 even smiled, shy and uncertain. Aya didn't. She just stared straight ahead, trying to understand what this photo meant. Proof of survival or evidence of shame. In American archives, only a handful of such POW photos survived censorship. Many were destroyed before publication, labeled sensitive, but those that did remain showed something rare, humanity unguarded. No propaganda, no staging, just people caught between surrender and grace. The medic flipped the camera shut, wiped his brow, and nodded. For the record, he muttered. Aya didn't understand the words, but she understood the weight behind them. Record, it meant their faces, their existence wouldn't vanish completely. That night, under dim lantern glow, the medic approached Aya's tent again. He handed her a small square of paper, still damp from development, a duplicate. Their group, standing awkwardly beside American soldiers, muds, battered and weary. No smiles, no hatred, just exhaustion and life. Aya held it carefully, eyes wide. She hid it inside her notebook before anyone else could see. The edges curled as it dried, the ink bleeding slightly, but the image stayed, proof that once she had stood side by side with the so-called enemy, and neither had drawn a weapon. Outside, the sea wind returned, soft and steady. Somewhere down the shoreline, ships waited, their horns echoing faintly through the night. And with that low, haunting sound, new rumors began to spread. "They're sending us home." The whispers began before dawn. Someone claimed to have overheard a guard say transport. Another swore he saw crates marked Tokyo. By sunrise, the rumor had become a heartbeat running through the camp. "They're sending us home." Aya tried not to believe it. Hope was dangerous, but the signs were undeniable. Trucks arrived. Officers sorted papers. For the first time, the barbed wire gates opened without rifles raised. Women packed what little they had. Aya folded her tattered uniform, slid her notebook and the photograph inside, and tied it with medical gauze. Some clutched empty food tins, others bits of soap or chocolate wrappers, souvenirs of survival. The same soldiers who had once shaved their eyebrows now handed out fresh clothes and blankets. One of them, the same medic from the photo, smiled and said, "Good luck." Aya didn't know the words, but she heard kindness in them. Reports from that period confirmed that by late 1945, nearly 10,000 Japanese POW, men and women, were repatriated from Pacific Islands back to their homeland. The process was systematic: identification, vaccination, then transport. Yet for these women it felt surreal. They had entered this camp as enemies, and were leaving as question marks, uncertain where they belonged. At the harbor, the sea stretched wide and pale under a washed-out sky. A U.S. Navy vessel waited offshore, its deck crowded with supplies and personnel. Aya stood at the rail, watching Okinawa shrink in the distance. The island that had once swallowed her identity was now fading into mist. Around her, the other nurses whispered prayers not of victory, but of survival. An American officer checked their names one last time, marking each in pencil. When he reached Aya, he hesitated, then offered a small wave. No salute, no formality, just a gesture between two people who'd shared the same storm. As the ship's horn sounded a low, mournful cry, the women turned toward the horizon. Some cried quietly, others just stared. Aya kept her notebook pressed to her chest, feeling the hum of the engines beneath her feet. The ocean smelled of salt and new beginnings. But as the island disappeared, dread crept in. She knew what waited at home: silence, judgment, and the word dishonor. And when the ship docked in Tokyo, her fears proved right. Tokyo smelled of smoke and sewage, not victory. The city was a skeleton, buildings gutted, streets split open, silence crawling through ruins. As the repatriation ship docked, no crowd waited, no family banners, only a few government officials with clipboards avoiding eye contact. When Aya stepped onto the pier, her legs trembling from weeks at sea, a cold wind cut through her thin uniform. She had dreamed of home for months, but home didn't dream of her. Captured women, someone whispered. The words spread faster than the tide. Locals turned away. One mother pulled her child behind her. Aya's group, nurses who had risked everything on the front lines, were now treated as stains on national honor. In the post were code of shame: surrender equaled death of spirit. They should have died. That's what people believed. Official surveys from the Japanese Welfare Ministry in 1946 reported that nearly 70% of repatriated female POW faced social ostracism. Families disowned them, fiancés disappeared, employers refused them work. Their survival, once miraculous, was now a burden. Aya was sent to a small hostel for returned prisoners. She sat among women with shaved heads, faded uniforms, and 1,000-yard stares. One murmured, "We came back alive, but we are ghosts." Aya didn't answer. She opened her notebook instead. The pages smelled faintly of sea salt, edges curled from humidity. Inside were her words, the truth she couldn't yet speak aloud. That night, prayer, spending her time in younger nature, can shoft your brother body, out of answered the door. His face went pale. "We thought you were dead," he said flatly, then closed it again. No embrace, just a lock clicking. Aya stood there, notebook pressed to her chest, the sound of her own breath louder than the city's ruin. She wandered through bombed-out streets until dawn, sitting finally beside a river, her reflection trembling in the water, eyebrows still faintly growing back. For the first time, she wondered if surviving had been the real sin. In the distance, a newspaper vendor shouted headlines about trials, occupation, rebuilding. None mentioned women like her, but Aya knew one thing: silence could kill slower than bullets, so she made a decision that night. She would write everything down, no matter the cost. Tokyo's nights were quieter than death. Aya lived in a tiny boarding room near Shinagawa, its window cracked and its floorboards warped from damp. She worked washing hospital sheets by day, and by night she wrote furiously, secretly. Her notebook had survived storms, camps, and shame. Now it became her only friend. The paper had grown thin, the pencil stubs short, but she wrote anyway, whispering each word like prayer. She described everything: the camp's smell of soap, the American soldiers' careful hands, the tin mirror, the storm. She even described the order that had started it all: shave your eyebrows. Then, beneath it, she wrote the line she feared most: "They made us shave our pride, not our honor." She knew those words could never be printed in post. War Japan. Anything sympathetic to the enemy was taboo, even dangerous. Censorship boards in the late 1940s banned dozens of POW testimonies for being unpatriotic. But Aya didn't care. Her story wasn't political, it was human. One cold night, she copied her diary by hand, page by page, and placed the second version into an envelope addressed to a nurse she had befriended through the Red Cross, an American woman named Helen. Aya wrote on the cover, "For history, not revenge." Then she mailed it overseas, hoping it might outlive her. Years passed. The original notebook she kept locked inside a wooden box beneath her floorboards. Every so often, she'd reread it by candlelight, tracing the faded pencil lines with trembling fingers. She never spoke of it to anyone, not even to her husband, whom she married quietly in 1952. He thought her silence was trauma. He never guessed it was testimony. Across Japan, many former POW hid similar diaries, fearing social ruin if discovered. Historians later found fragments in attics, hospital closets, and family chests. Together, they painted a picture not of betrayal, but of survival rewritten in a different language: kindness. One spring evening, decades later, Aya's granddaughter found the box while cleaning the old house. Inside lay the notebook, brittle but legible. She opened it, gasped softly, and saw a photo tucked inside eyebrowless women standing beside smiling American medics. Stamped faintly on the back, Camp K, Okinawa, 1945. The granddaughter didn't know it yet, but that discovery would set history moving again. Nearly 40 years later, in 1984, a dusty archive in Yokohama stirred awake. Fluorescent lights flickered above stacks of forgotten files, war reports, Red Cross manifests, faded microfilm reels. Inside one unmarked box, an American historian named Daniel Lewis opened a thin folder labeled Camp K Okinawa, 1945. Inside were photographs, inspection notes, and a brittle handwritten diary in Japanese, Aya's diary. The paper crumbled at the edges, the pencil lines barely visible, but the words were unmistakable. Her phrasing spare, factual, aching, cut through the decades. Daniel had read hundreds of war testimonies, but never one like this. Here was a woman describing the enemy's mercy with the same precision she used to record pain. They shaved us, one entry read, and somehow, in that act, they returned our humanity. He cross-referenced her notes with medical records and confirmed details long buried. The typhoon, the hygiene protocols, even the group photograph. In a separate folder, he found that very image Aya in the front row, chin lifted, eyes steady. No propaganda, no posing. Just truth. That year, Daniel catalogued 47 surviving prisoner accounts across the Pacific, but Aya's stood apart. It wasn't about battle. It was about perception, he wrote in his field notes. She dismantles hatred without preaching, just details, just honesty. The diary's existence challenged decades of post-war narratives. Both nations had preferred simpler stories, victors and victims, guilt and shame. Aya's account blurred those lines, forcing readers to face an uncomfortable truth: that compassion could survive even in a war built on dehumanization. When Daniel published his findings in a small journal, Japanese academics initially ignored it. Then, foreign correspondents picked it up. A black and white scan of the eyebrowless women appeared in magazines with the headline, "Kindness Behind Barbed Wire." Letters flooded in from former soldiers, nurses, and families. Some denied it. Others cried reading it. Daniel was invited to present his findings at a university in Tokyo. In the front row sat a quiet woman clutching a photograph of Aya's granddaughter. After the lecture, she approached him with tears in her eyes and whispered, "She was my grandmother." Daniel nodded, speechless. Outside, news vans waited. The story had escaped the archives, and soon it would ignite a controversy neither side was ready for. By early 1985, the quiet discovery had turned into a national argument. Newspapers splashed headlines that screamed across front pages, U.S. Humiliation of POW. Others countered with, acts of compassion hidden for decades. The country that had long buried its shame now found itself divided not over the war, but over a single story of shaved eyebrows and unexpected mercy. Television panels filled with veterans, professors, and politicians. Some insisted the Americans had stripped those women of dignity. Others said it was an act of hygiene, survival, and even humanity. The photo of Aya and her fellow prisoners, eyebrowless, mud-streaked, standing beside calm American medics, became an icon and a battlefield. In Tokyo, Daniel Lewis faced crowds outside the university gates. Reporters shouted questions in 2 languages. He simply said, "It's not about blame. It's about how people treated each other when no one was watching." That quote ran in every major paper. Meanwhile, Aya's granddaughter appeared on a late-night talk show. She held the original notebook, its pages yellow and fragile. "My grandmother never asked to be defended," she said softly. "She asked to be remembered." Her calmness silenced the studio. Media records show that month saw a 120% spike in coverage of Japanese POW narratives. Schools requested translations, museums asked for copies, but not everyone welcomed the attention. Nationalist groups called the story weak, accusing it of glorifying surrender. One editorial read, "Kindness is not history, it is distraction." For Aya's family, the noise was unbearable. Her granddaughter received anonymous letters calling her a traitor. Daniel was accused of fabricating evidence. Yet through the chaos, the truth only grew stronger. Historians confirmed the diary's authenticity, tracing its postal route through the Red Cross and Helen's records in California. Aya's handwriting matched perfectly. In one televised debate, a veteran of the U.S. Medical Corps stood up, trembling, and said, "I was there. We shaved their eyebrows because we didn't want them to die." The audience fell silent. For the first time, both nations seemed to inhale the same breath. And then, one night, Aya's granddaughter stepped forward again, with the proof that would end the argument forever. The studio lights were blinding. Cameras hummed, lenses aimed like weapons of memory. Aya's granddaughter stood center stage, clutching a sealed archival envelope. The host introduced her softly. "Tonight, we close a 40-year mystery." The crowd, journalists, historians, veterans, leaned forward as she unwrapped the brittle paper and revealed the object inside. Aya's original notebook. Under glass, its pencil lines glimmered faintly. The anchor read aloud one final passage, voice trembling. "They shaved our brows, but gave us back our faces." Silence filled the studio. You could almost hear the air itself pause. In that moment, the argument ended. What had been debated as humiliation was now understood as something far deeper. A moment where empathy survived inside the machinery of war. The diary didn't erase atrocities or rewrite history. It simply refused to let kindness be forgotten. In the following months, historians from both Japan and America collaborated to verify every name, every date, every inspection note from Camp K. Their findings aligned. The eyebrow order had originated as a hygiene directive, not cruelty. But what mattered most wasn't the policy. It was what happened around it. How compassion had slipped through protocol. In 2015, 70 years after the war's end, Okinawa's Peace Memorial Museum unveiled a small exhibit, The Faces of Camp K. Behind glass hung the group photograph, restored from Aya's notebook, beside her handwritten pages. Visitors often stopped longest at one line underlined twice in pencil. "They treated us better than our officers did." Veterans who once denied the story began sending letters. One wrote, "We didn't know mercy could echo louder than gunfire." The exhibit became one of the museum's most visited rooms, drawing thousands each year. Students stood in front of the photo, whispering that it didn't look like war. It looked like survival. Aya never lived to see her words honored. She died quietly in 1979, her notebook still hidden under floorboards. But her granddaughter stood at the exhibit's opening, tears streaking down her face. In the glass, she saw her reflection merge with her grandmother's image. Two faces separated by 70 years, sharing the same faint eyebrows and the same quiet defiance. Because sometimes history isn't about who won, it's about who stayed human.